So what do organizations and companies alike need to do to prepare themselves and ready themselves for the use of Microsoft 365 Copilot? What does a typical technical assessment look like in that regard?
Okay, so if we're looking purely at the technical side of things, so technical readiness, we'll put aside the adoption, the onboarding, that side of things, look at technical readiness. Probably makes sense to start by looking, okay, what risks is Copilot going to introduce or accentuate? So what happens when you assign someone a Microsoft 365 Copilot license? It's going to help them surface information from Microsoft 365, and it's going to help them generate new content based on that information as well. So when you ask Copilot a question, it uses something called the Microsoft Graph, which is a data model behind the scenes to get information back from Microsoft 365. And that all happens in the context of the user. So Copilot doesn't have access to any information that the user don't have access to. So that's a common misconception. It's not going to show you anything you don't have access to. What it can do, though, is surface information that you do have access to, but possibly shouldn't. So information that's not properly secured. The other typical risk is if you're storing lots of out-of-date information, you can't really expect Copilot to give you coherent answers based on that information. So the usual example I give is if you're storing 4 different versions of your paternity leave policy, and you ask Copilot, how much paternity leave am I entitled to? Copilot's not going to be able to give you a coherent answer. If you're not storing that coherent information, you're not going to get consistent results. So it's primarily about exposing information you don't have access to and answering questions based on out-of-date or inaccurate information.
So fundamentally, it sounds like it's a data governance issue that you're trying to resolve ahead of the implementation and the adoption of Copilot.
Yes, yeah, very much a data governance issue. And these risks aren't unique to Copilot either. You'd have exactly the same scenario with Microsoft 365 Search. There's a risk it's going to show you stuff you shouldn't have access to. There's a risk it's going to surface out-of-date information. We saw similar things. I don't know if you remember Delve.
Yes, yeah.
Very similar risks and challenges and concerns there. It's showing people all of these files. And people are saying, why is it showing me all these files? These should be secure. It's not causing those issues, but it is shining a light on them. It's bringing them to the surface.
Yeah. And what areas of Microsoft 365 do you think that people should focus their attention on?
Okay, so within Microsoft 365, there's basically 3 areas where your data can live. You've got Exchange, where your email lives. You've got SharePoint, and you've got OneDrive for Business. Exchange and OneDrive for Business, they're fairly user-centric. So if you're looking at Exchange, for example, Copilot's got access to emails you've sent, emails you've received. Fairly straightforward. OneDrive for Business as well, it's got access to your OneDrive and to any files that have been shared with you from other people's OneDrive. So they're not risk-free, but the real focus, 95% of this, is the data that's in SharePoint. So if you're an organization that's on this Microsoft Cloud journey, chances are most of your content, most of your unstructured content, your files are going to be in SharePoint. That's either directly or indirectly through platforms like Teams. There's lots of advantages to having that content in SharePoint. So Copilot's got easy access to all of that information, but it's also where governance issues typically come up as well. It's SharePoint's usually where you want to be focusing your efforts on this.
Yeah, and presumably for organizations who perhaps maybe haven't quite started that Microsoft 365 journey, and for those organizations who still remain on premise and have traditional file stores, presumably Copilot can operate in the same way as it would if that information was available in SharePoint.
No, I mean, fundamentally, so off the shelf, Copilot works with Microsoft 365. Microsoft 365 Copilot works with Microsoft 365 data.
Mm-hmm.
There are ways of extending it and bringing in other information, integrating other content sources, but day one, it's going to work with the data you've got in Microsoft 365. So your file shares on day one are going to be out of scope.
Mm.
Kind of good from a governance perspective, because you get to start with a blank slate,
Yeah.
greenfield, you get to do it right. But yeah, it's not going to give you answers on that content out of the blocks.
So what does good data governance look like in SharePoint?
Well, in an ideal world, first of all, make sure we got the architecture right.
Mm-hmm.
So move away from any sort of centralized, heavily nested site structures, move towards a modern, granular site structure where business users own the sites.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got real clear information ownership. That's kind of step one. Ideally, we bring in data classification and labeling.
Mm-hmm.
So you understand where you're storing the sensitive stuff, the confidential stuff, the public stuff. We bring in encryption and rights management for the most sensitive stuff, so that if those files leave SharePoint, they're encrypted. That encryption applies to Copilot as well. The rights management applies to Copilot as well. Ideally, we bring in DLP, data loss prevention, as a safety net that prevents users from sharing files with the wrong people. It can also step in and lock down files if they are stored in the wrong place.
Mm-hmm.
And probably most importantly of all, you bring in lifecycle management.
Mm.
So ideally, every piece of information you're storing has a life cycle. Yeah. There'll be some stuff you're obliged to keep for 7 years, like your financial records. There'll be other stuff that you should be deleting probably after 6 months, mm-hmm. like your HR content, your CVs. Having that lifecycle management so that you're only storing stuff for as long as you need to is really key to good data governance.
Yeah, which is, from what I understand, available within the functionality that's available within Purview.
Yes, exactly. It's Purview. Depending on your Microsoft 365 license level, mm-hmm. you'll get access to a certain amount of Purview functionality as well. So if you're on E3 or Business Premium, you'll get the basic Purview capabilities, and if you're E5, you'll get the more sophisticated stuff. Well, there's various ways of doing it through add-ons.
Yeah, and just looking back at all of the kind of things that you need to consider as you just walked us through, it seems like a lot of work. Do companies actually really need to go through some of those things that you've outlined in order to start using Copilot?
Yes and no. So yes, all of those things. It's a huge undertaking.
Yeah,
like it's a massive job. It's a journey. You're going to do this over probably 2+ years. You can't do it overnight. There are things you can do in the meantime to start to get your tenants, your Microsoft 365 data in order, and start using Copilot in a controlled and managed way. So it doesn't have to be that sort of adoption cliff to get all that perfect data governance in place. There are things you can do to introduce it gradually.
So what is SharePoint Advanced Management?
So SharePoint Advanced Management, it's been around for 2 or 3 years. Mm-hmm. It's a suite of tools that help you to govern SharePoint sites. So it gives you things like the ability to create policies to identify inactive SharePoint sites, policies to identify potentially orphaned SharePoint sites or SharePoint sites without a minimum number of owners, policies to detect sites with problematic sharing, so lots of permissions customization that can cause problems for Copilot, and those kind of controls.
So an incredibly useful tool. I guess my question is, 1, how do customers get their hands on it? And 2, how much does it cost?
Okay, so it was originally launched as an add-on, and the full SharePoint Advanced Management is still sold as an add-on. So it doesn't matter whether you're Business Premium or E3 or E5, If you want to buy it, you buy it as a per user per month add-on.
Mhm.
I think it's about £3 per user per month, and you would need to license everybody, all your users. What Microsoft started doing last year, however, is bundling it with Copilot. So once you buy a Copilot license, you unlock, it's about 90%, most of these SharePoint Advanced Management capabilities for your organization. So it's a really efficient way to get this. If you are adopting Copilot, Microsoft recognise that you might need a little bit of help getting a grip on your SharePoint data. So they're making this functionality available to you.
So presumably, as it's now included within Copilot, every user within the organization would require a Copilot license in order to obtain that functionality?
No, so the functionality is more centralized.
Right.
So basically, the kind of policies we're talking about, you're either going to run them across the organization or not at all. They're not really things you can target your users. So you actually only need to get one Copilot license. As long as you're licensing one or more users for Microsoft 365 Copilot, you're going to unlock these SharePoint Advanced Management capabilities for your organization. So it's a really efficient way of getting that functionality.
So we've spoken of a bunch of tools and processes and things that generally people should consider when considering the adoption of Microsoft 365 Copilot. But in practice and in reality, what does that actually mean? What does that look like for a customer or an organization?
Okay, so I mean, the tools we covered, basically there's a sort of toolbox of governance capabilities that are available to you. And what we need to do is to build those into a roadmap. So let's say we're a medium-sized company, around about 100 employees. Let's say we're using SharePoint, but it's a bit of a swamp. Where do we start? So let's look at, okay, what do we do in the short term, medium term, and longer term?
So we've spoken of a bunch of tools and processes and things that generally people should consider when considering the adoption of Microsoft 365 Copilot. But in practice and in reality, what does that actually mean? What does that look like for a customer or an organization?
Okay, so I mean, the tools we covered, basically there's a sort of toolbox of governance capabilities that are available to you. And what we need to do is to build those into a roadmap. So let's say we're a medium-sized company, around about 100 employees. Let's say we're using SharePoint, but it's a bit of a swamp. Where do we start? So let's look at, okay, what do we do in the short term, medium term, and longer term?
So what does a short-term roadmap look like?
Okay, so in the short term, we want to start using Microsoft 365 Copilot, but our SharePoint environment is a swamp. There's a couple of tools you can introduce that control which SharePoint sites Copilot has access to. So which sites Copilot can use as content sources, as grounding data to answer your questions. First one is restricted SharePoint search, which is an allow list approach. Basically, you're saying Copilot and search, organization-wide search, can only use these specific SharePoint sites. The other way of doing it is restricted content discovery, which is very similar, but it's a block list approach. So you're basically saying Copilot can answer questions based on any SharePoint site apart from these particularly sensitive sites that I put in this list.
They sound fairly similar. Why would you use one above the other?
So it's really going to depend on scenarios. If you're in a position where you're broadly comfortable with SharePoint governance and you know where your sensitive data is, then that block list approach, that restricted content discovery of saying stay away from these sites might work. If you're coming at it, I don't know, overuse the word swamp, but if you're coming at it where your SharePoint environment is the Wild West, and you want to go site by site and basically audit every site before you let Copilot near it, then that restricted SharePoint search is a good way of doing it, because as you audit a site, you can add it to the allow list
Mm-hmm.
and then progressively expand the scope of what Copilot can access. But they're both sticking plaster solutions. They're designed to buy you time, so they're short-term rather than long-term solutions to letting you get started with Copilot while buying you some time to do the hard yards and sort out your SharePoint environment.
And based on your example organization that you used earlier of 100 seats or 100 employees, roughly in your experience, how long would an exercise like this typically take?
With these kind of approaches, you can get started pretty quickly. So it's really doing enough of an audit to establish which sites you're comfortable with allowing Copilot access to, or which sites you're sure that Copilot should stay well away from. So yeah, I would say within a month you could get up and running with this kind of approach.
And is that something you would advise internal administrators to lead with, or would you work in collaboration with an organization like us to deliver that for them?
It's really going to depend on your capabilities. So if you've got the in-house capabilities to review these sites, to identify problematic sites, to use some of those SharePoint Advanced Management reports to identify problematic sites, then you might well be able to run with that in-house. But obviously organizations like us can help with that as well.
So that's the short term sorted, but what about medium term? What should customers consider as part of that roadmap?
So the medium term's really where the hard work starts. This is where you need to be shifting your approach from reactive to proactive. And one of the simplest things you can do is to start auditing your SharePoint sites. So start figuring out, okay, where your sensitive data is, which sites have out of control permissions, and so on. And the idea is that as you audit sites, you're progressively expanding the number of sites you can bring into scope for Copilot. And some of the tools we mentioned, the SharePoint Advanced Management tools, can help to do that. So, for example, identifying sites with no owners, inactive sites, they're a really common source of problematic data. Because if the site's orphaned, it's got no owner, or it's dormant, the chances are no one's on top of that data. No one's sure whether it's accurate, up to date, litigious, or what it is. It's completely dark data. So using some of those tools can really help. Identifying the sites with out of control permissions can really help as well. So one of the things that SharePoint Advanced Management includes is something called data access governance reports. And these reports will pinpoint the sites with lots of content that's shared with everybody in the organization, or lots of content that's shared externally, or lots of content where permissions have been customized at multiple levels, which in SharePoint, that's basically makes it hellish to audit. So using some of those tools, getting a grip on those sites, going site by site, identifying the clean sites, identifying the problematic sites, and expanding the scope of which sites can work with Copilot is a good thing to do.
That sounds quite intensive, quite onerous. How much time would you expect an organization to be investing in going through that process?
So it's really going to depend on the scale of your data, but I would say use the tools. So going manually site by site through your SharePoint environment, and bearing in mind, if you look at the list of SharePoint sites in your environment, you've got the SharePoint sites that have been created because someone set up an Outlook group. You've got the SharePoint sites that have been created because someone set up a team or a private channel or a shared channel. You are going to have potentially thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of sites. Don't go through them manually. So use the tools, use the data access governance reports, use the inactive sites reports. Really use those tools that are available to you to focus in on where the problems are. You've also got a few capabilities within Purview, so things like Data Explorer. So if you want to see where specific sensitive information types like personally identifiable information, financial data, health data, if you want to see where those kinds of data sit within your SharePoint environment or within your Microsoft 365 tenants, Purview's got some great tools to help you do that. So really, I guess the core message is, use the tools that are available to really focus your efforts.
And would it be fair to say that the tools are there to assess what the current situation is and provide those organizations with the information that's needed in order to inform a series of sensible remedial plans? But can those tools help support with the remediation of some of those flaws that may have been found?
Yeah, they can do. It's a good point. So I guess you've got a kind of dual purpose. Mm-hmm. So on one hand, they're helping you with this audit. They're kind of shining a light on this is where we think the problems are. Mm-hmm. The other side of it is that remediation. So for example, if we take an inactive sites policy, mm-hmm. we can set it up so, okay, if a site's inactive, send a notification to the site owners. Ask them, okay, is this site still required? If they don't respond, step one, let's make the site read-only. Mm-hmm. So we're limiting the damage it can do. If after, say, 3 months or 6 months, that site is still inactive, then maybe we push it into Microsoft 365 Archive. Mm-hmm. So we take it out of scope of search, out of scope of Copilot. We put it into the archive. We've still got the ability to bring it back if we need to. Mm-hmm. But we're automating that, managing that problem. Basically, if no one's going to stand up and own that content and attest that we still need it, then let's push it out the way. Similar idea with data access governance reports as well. If we want to, we can use that to trigger a remediation process. So we can prompt the site owners to say, hey, look, our governance reports have flagged you've got way too many custom permissions on this site. Please remediate it. So there's lots we can do to drive remediation from these activities. It does come down to getting the fundamentals right to some mm-hmm. degree. So some organizations, if you've been running with SharePoint for a long time, you might have this very centralized model where you've got enormous sites that are managed centrally by IT, and they're saying, okay, well, you can have a folder for your team and a folder for your team. All of these tools aren't really designed to work with those kind of classic structures, because we can't look at that structure and say, okay, who's the owner of this data? Who do we need to loop into this process? Who do we need to see whether this is still required? So there is some element of getting that architecture right as well, making sure that you're architecting information around who owns it. That's really key. You've probably heard me bang on about it a lot, but getting information ownership right is the single biggest thing you can do to get data under control. Because the owner, the person who's responsible for the data, they're the person who can answer the questions. They're the person who can say, yes, we need this, or no, this can be deleted, or we need to keep this for 6 months and then delete it, or no, legislation has changed, we need to scrap this and rewrite it. Empowering those owners really underpins all of this. So we've got all these great tools, but there is that kind of fundamental assumption that that you're going to organize things in a sensible way.
So we've spoken a lot around modernizing SharePoint and its supporting architecture, but in practice, what does that actually look like?
Okay, so lots of the tools that we talked about. So restricted content discovery, restricted SharePoint search, all of these SharePoint advanced management policies for identifying inactive sites, orphaned sites, sites with complex permissions. They're all making an assumption that you've got a modern SharePoint architecture. And the modern SharePoint architecture is basically granular SharePoint sites, so small focused SharePoint sites, Ideally, those SharePoint sites are owned by people within the business rather than a central IT team. So ideally, we're organising around ownership, organising around access management, organising around sensitivity. What you might have in practice, if you've been using SharePoint a long time, is much bigger, centrally owned SharePoint sites with lots of sub-sites, where it's far harder to actually look at those sites and say, well, who owns this?
Yeah.
Who's responsible for what? Which bits of this can be kept? Which bits can be archived and so on?
So to your point earlier, ownership plays a critical role in everything that we're discussing here.
Definitely.
We've seen this quite often where we're speaking with customers or prospects who perhaps maybe don't feel they're in a position to move forward with a project like this because of the lack of ownership or because of those owners no longer being within the business. In those types of scenarios, how do we or internal administrators support the business in being able to move forward with a project like this?
Okay, so I think the first thing to say is if you've got a set of content with no owner, you've got a data risk because no one's really accountable for making sure that there's not problematic content in there. So you need to identify an owner. I mean, the first thing we'd say is these policies, if a site is orphaned, no one owns it, then potentially you're looking at archiving that site or at least making it read-only until someone's willing to stand up and take ownership of it. In practice, usually you're going team by team to an organisation. If you're modernising any kind of file storage environment, you're going to go team by team. You're going to gather requirements. You're going to look at what content they're storing. You're going to look at who should be taking ownership of it. And you'll try and build a plan that way around. So there's always an element of reviewing, figuring out, okay, well, who's actually contributing to the content, who's showing up in the metadata as editing a lot of this content, and you look to build a picture of who should be taking ownership of that content.
So assuming that an organization is operating in that classic way as you described, getting to a place of modernization with a modern SharePoint architecture sounds like it could potentially be quite a big job. With that being said, where does an organization start?
Yes, it's potentially a huge job. So start with a pilot, and then you're going to do it in phases. Really, you're going to have to go team by team. You're not going to want to do this as a big bang project. So start with a pilot, phase by phase, progressive modernization. I think the other thing is you've got to sell it to the users as you go. You've got to have a way of getting user buy-in and showing them that this is worth it, because you need their engagement, you need their input to go through this modernization process. And the AI adoption can actually be a helpful way of doing that. So you're basically going through this modernization process to get your data in a fit state where they can then start to benefit from using some of these AI tools.
Because of course Copilot is so heavily dependent on that architecture that you described earlier in order to provide it with the results that's needed to enable the user to do what they do.
Yes, exactly. So the value of Copilot, or the safety of Copilot, and the value of Copilot, the sensibleness of the answers that you're going to get out of Copilot, all of that is driven almost entirely by how effective your data governance is.
So classic data governance tools, things like sensitivity classifications, is that something that is a consideration for Copilot, and is that something that we also need to consider as part of the medium-term strategy that we're discussing?
It's definitely something to start thinking about at this stage. So there's really two sides to it. Sensitivity classification in itself will help your data governance. It's helping you to understand where your sensitive data is. So fundamentally, that's the main driver for classification. It's the know your data thing. It's understanding this is where my sensitive data is, this is where my confidential data is, and so on. The other side of it, if your sensitivity labels impose rights management. Copilot will respect those labels. So if you're using Copilot to generate content, and some of your source content has sensitivity labels, and those labels don't grant the user the right to extract content from that file, then Copilot's not going to touch it. So any protection that those labels impose, Copilot's going to work within those restrictions. If you use Copilot to generate content, it will carry forward labels as well. So if I ask Copilot to draft a proposal for me, and the source content that is drawing on to draft that proposal is labeled confidential, then Copilot's going to put a confidential label on the output as well. So it's going to carry forward that data classification. So DLP as well is probably the other one that's worth thinking about at this stage, in terms of giving you that safety net, in that this classification is all very well, but what happens if something is misclassified? What happens if it contains sensitive data, but it's got the wrong label on it, or it's being put in the wrong place? DLP is designed to handle exactly those kind of scenarios. And from a Copilot perspective, if a sensitive file is in the wrong place, Copilot would potentially have access to that sensitive data, but the DLP policy detects the sensitive information in that file, locks it down, and prevents that access from happening. So those, what we call the classic, the Purview data protection, data governance controls do have a role to play at this stage as well.
So the roadmap is really starting to take shape now. We've looked at short, medium-term aspirations, but longer term, what do organizations really need to consider as part of this overall roadmap?
Okay, so I think the first thing to say with data governance, you always need a continuous improvement approach. You don't get to a point where you say, we're done with data governance now, project's over, everything's fine. It is a process of review, improve, adapt, and so on. Broadly, where we want to get to, we want good lifecycle management in place. So we want to be deleting the stuff that needs to be deleted. We want to be preserving the stuff we need to keep. And there are a great set of tools in Purview for doing that. So data lifecycle management and records management. We want to get to a point where we've got proactive SharePoint site governance. So all of these SharePoint advanced management tools that we've talked about along the way, we want that to be in place and running and baked into our operations. So we're doing that on a monthly, a regular basis. We want to get to a point where we've got good coverage with our sensitivity classification. So we've got our users classifying files, classifying emails when they send them. We might also be using automated or on-demand classification to trawl through the older stuff and classify that. We want to have a good set of DLP policies in place. So we've got that safety net, so files that aren't classified or are misclassified or in the wrong place, we've got some additional layers of protection there. We might also be using things like DSPM for AI, so data security posture management for AI, and that gives us insight into how people are using Copilot, how they're using any other AI tools that they've got access to. So really, I guess the short version of that answer is drawing on all of these capabilities that we've got available, having that really proactive approach, that operational approach to managing our data in a consistent way.